Hey guys, welcome to CSM Live. Thank you guys for joining us.
Yeah, guys, welcome to another week here of Cornerstone Live, Student Ministry Live. We're going to dive back into this.
Yeah, so we're in part 3 of Job. As you can see, we are only going to be at the most 15 minutes tonight. So we're in part 3 of Job, and here we're going to see something kind of unexpected happen. This is not something that when you get to the end of this chapter or the end of this section of verses that you expect, but somebody new shows up. It made me think of that part on Endgame. At the very end, when there's the big battle, and it looks like Thanos is going to win. This is like, I don't know what it is about that part of the movie, but every time I see it, I'm pumped. I'm like, yes. When it looks like Captain America's about to lose, when Thanos is about to take over, and then you hear like the fuzzy intercom come in, and it's Falcon, and he's like, Cap, on your left. And then, Falcon comes flying through, and then all the little rings start to open, and Black Panther walks through, and at that point, you know, like, Thanos is in trouble. This is about to get real. Like, you weren't expecting that. It looked like there's finally about to be a big showdown, and then these unexpected people show up. And that's kind of what we're going to see tonight. Not quite the same situation or circumstance, but we have an unexpected visitor show up tonight in Job. So where are we at in Job so far?
Yeah, so how do we get here? So we're looking at Job, and he's this guy that when we first meet him, he's this awesome figure who just has a lot of money, he has a lot of kids, and he's got a lot of possessions and a lot of status. Like he's a pretty reputable dude. But then we see that the devil comes in, and he, with permission of God, takes all of this from him, and he really tests him and starts to put him through the ringer a little bit to where he's going to have to struggle and go through some hard times. So we see him lose everything he has, and then we also see his friends kind of step in and start to accuse him and really kind of show him, this is your fault. You're doing something. We don't know what it is. We're not going to give you an answer or a reason. We're just going to say that you're harboring some sort of sin in your life to where God is punishing you for this.
Yeah. What Job's friends are working from, as they're saying these things to him, it's called the retribution principle. And what the retribution principle states is that the righteous will be rewarded and the wicked will suffer. Now, there's truth to that. That is a true principle in which we just understand it differently than what Job and Job's friends were understanding it. So we understand that if we live righteously, if we obey God, if we are walking in His will, that we will be rewarded. But the rewards that we receive aren't often tangible. You can't always feel them, you can't always touch them, you can't always hold them, but they're spiritual blessings. But what they were working off of at this point, you have to remember, this happened before Job had the law available to him. So they're working strictly off of this retribution principle, saying, Job, you must have done something wrong because you're being punished. Just admit to it. Admit what it is. And so what we're about to look at tonight, before we get into this unexpected visitor, is we're going to see where Job is right before this guy shows up. So Job's in this point to where it's in chapter 31. He kind of makes his final protest. This is, if you think about a court case, think about a closing argument. And this is Job's closing argument. And he just goes through all these kind of theoretical or these sins that are hypothetical in his life. And he says, I have made a covenant with my eyes. So what he's saying when he starts this off is he is just admitting that I haven't even looked at anything wrong. I've made a covenant with my eyes that I am not going to look at anything dishonoring to God. And then he follows it up with verse 5. And in verse 5.
Yeah, and then he moves on and he says, if I have walked in any falsehood. So he's basically saying, if I have not been honest, or if I have lied, if I've done anything that would cause God to punish me, tell me about it. Show me what it is.
Yeah. And then verse 7, he says, if my step has turned aside from the way, and my heart has gone after my own eyes. So he's saying, if my heart has been led by something that my eyes have desired, then I'm guilty of that too. And then verse 13.
Yeah, he says, if I have rejected the cause of my manservant or maidservant, and he's basically talking about how have I treated other people? Even the people who work under me, who serve me, have I been mean to them? Have I not been generous? Have I not provided for them? So he's just kind of saying, I even treat other people just as good as I would treat myself.
And then verse 16, he says, if I've withheld anything from the poor. So he's saying, I've been compassionate. I haven't kept anything back from people in need.
And then in verse 24, he even goes a little bit further with that, talking more about money. He says, have I made gold my trust? Like, is my faith put in my money? We talked about him having all these possessions, but does he worship that, or does he depend on that money? So he does. He says he doesn't even do that.
Yeah. And then in verse 29, he says, if I have rejoiced at the ruin of him who hated me. So he's saying, if I haven't even taken pleasure in my enemies failing, or destruction or despair coming to people who hate me. I'm not even guilty of that. So he's saying, and then he says, if I've concealed my transgression as others do, saying, I don't even have secret sin. Like, I'm not even pretending that I haven't sinned. I'm not putting up a front for you guys to try to convince you that I haven't sinned. But if I'm even lying about sinning, and then he follows every single one of these hypothetical sins up with like some sort of curse or punishment, saying, if I've made gold my trust, if I've looked at, if I've lusted with my eyes, if I've lied to anybody, if I've rejected the cause of my servants, if I've rejoiced in those who hated me, if I've done any of these things, then I'm guilty and deserving of punishment. But I haven't done any of them. And then he closes with this very bold statement in chapter 31.
Yeah, so he's almost like asking and crying for God to hear him. And what he says is this. He says, oh, that I had one to hear me. Here's my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. Oh, that I have the indictment written on my adversary. Surely I would carry it on my shoulder. I would bind it on me as a crown. I would give him an account of all my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him.
So this is bold. What Job is doing here is he is calling out God. He's demanding an audience with God so that he can plead his case. He feels like God's being unfair in this moment, and he wants to get in front of God and say, God, I haven't done any of these sins. I've lived a life that is honoring to you. Hear my plea. And at that point, Job's friends have nothing to say. They drop silent, because what can they say in response to Job demanding an audience with God? That he's willing to plead his case before God shows that he is serious about not having committed any of these sins. So he's saying, God, listen to my plea. And then we feel like all up to this point, these conversations of Job and his friends going back and forth have led to this moment where we're finally going to get this big showdown between Job and God. That Job is going to get to plead his case before God. God's going to listen. It's going to clear some things up. That Job's finally going to be like, all right, God, what is going on? What have you done? What have I done to bring this upon me? Why have you done this to me? And so this big climax is about to happen, where we're about to see the showdown between Job and God. And then in steps Elihu. Somebody who hasn't even been in the book of Job up to this point. Who's Elihu?
Yeah, so this is kind of like that Black Panther moment that he was talking about, where he just kind of comes in and sort of like brings everybody back to like, this is like a more of a reality, kind of like something you can kind of plug yourself into, and he kind of brings some reason into the situation. So like we don't really know who he is, like Mr. Alston just said. So we know he's a young guy because he allows the older people to speak before he does, and we know so that shows that he has respect. But he really just kind of comes in with this sense of frustration and knowing that his friends haven't really spoken much life into him, and that he himself has kind of spoken against God. So he comes in and adds some reason and some biblical and godly sense into the whole situation.
Yeah, so one of the things that Elihu does that I love is he comes into this conversation and he enters it in silence with respect for people that are older than him. And this isn't just something that we need to give respect to people that are older than us. But I heard somebody say before, you can enter a room of people with one of two ways. You can enter that room thinking nobody in that room has anything to offer you and that you're smarter than everyone. Or you can enter that room and assume everyone in that room has something to offer you. And Elihu enters this conversation believing and keeping quiet that these wise men are going to offer Job some solid spiritual advice. They're going to guide him correctly with wisdom. But finally, he just gets so frustrated, and he's like, I have to speak up. I am young in years, you are old, but you have not been good friends. He condemns Job's friends, saying, you guys haven't helped at all. You're supposed to be wise, you're older than I am, but you have been terrible at telling Job what to do. You've been terrible at comforting him at this point. There's no wisdom to be found in what you have said. And then he turns his attention to Job, and he looks at Job and he basically says, who do you think you are? Like, what kind of self-righteousness do you possess in order to think that you are capable of going in front of God and pleading your case?
And he basically just attacks this entire argument that Job had laid out for himself, saying, you say you're so righteous, you say you don't do any of these things, but you're almost comparing yourself to how good God is. And really, there's no comparison to that. And he outlines this, and he says he's not punishing you. He said he has no reason to punish you, but you're still not on par with the righteousness of God. And he goes in and saying it's almost better that these things would have happened to you if you sinned. But really, what are you even saying when you accomplish? What are you accomplishing if you say that? So he says, if you have sinned, what do you accomplish against him? And if your transgressions are multiplied, what do you do to him? If you are righteous, what do you give to him? Or what does he receive from your hand? Your wickedness concerns a man like yourself, and your righteousness a son of man.
So what Elihu is saying here is he's saying when you sin, it's not affecting God. God is not affected by your sin. Who's affected by your sin is you and your fellow man. So Elihu, he's not working off the retribution principle from the same perspective that Job and his friends were. They're saying, because what they were saying is everything that you do negatively is going to be punished while you're on earth. Everything that you do positively is going to be rewarded while you're on earth. And Elihu's coming in and saying God's ways are greater than ours. We can't fully understand what he is doing. But your sin will affect you. Your sin will affect other people. But God is not affected by it because God is so great, God is sovereign, God is so majestic that he is not going to be affected by really mere humans here on earth. I think Elihu's basically entire, when he takes up 5 chapters, really comes down to one statement. It's saying that life is not fair, but God is just.
Very much so. And then he kind of brings it all home. And this is kind of his drop the mic moment when he comes in here. At the end of verse 37, he says, the Almighty, we cannot find him. He is great in power. Justice and abundant righteousness he will not violate. Therefore, men fear him. So he is just so far beyond all the greatness we could ever imagine to where, like Mr. Austin said, he's just not affected by our sin. He is perfect in and of himself. But he will provide that righteousness and that justice because it's in his character.
Yeah. So what's interesting that we see about Elihu, and next week we're going to finish up the book of Job, but one thing that we're going to see as we get into next week and why we can take some confidence in what Elihu was saying to Job is that when we see God speak next week, we see God is going to rebuke Job's friends, and we're going to see God rebuke Job. But Elihu is not rebuked. So we see that Elihu is one that brings some sense and some godly wisdom and advice into the situation, saying, guys, we are not fully going to understand God. We're not going to understand his ways. We're not going to understand his justice. But we can have faith and we can have trust in knowing that God is just. And even in times when we don't understand what he is doing and how he is working, we can take confidence in knowing that the God who is in control of everything loves us. So guys, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. Appreciate you being here. Looking forward to seeing you guys again in the next week or so when we get back together.